Jimmy's question hung in the air. The orchestra went silent, and 300 audience members held their breath because Patrick Dempsey heard that sound from the back of the studio, and everything stopped. It was a Tuesday night in October 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studio 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Another celebrity interview. Another round of laughs and stories and promotional clips. Patrick Dempsey was there to talk about his latest project. A film that had him traveling the world, working with acclaimed directors, doing what he'd done brilliantly for decades. Everything was going perfectly. Jimmy had just asked a question about filming in Italy. Patrick was mid-answer, gesturing with his hands, that familiar charismatic smile on his face. The audience was engaged. The cameras were rolling smoothly. It was textbook late-night television. And then someone coughed. Not a regular cough. A specific cough. Vet. Labored. The kind of cough that carries weight, that tells a story before any words are spoken. It came from somewhere near the back studio entrance, where production assistants usually stood during tapings. Patrick Dempsey stopped speaking mid-sentence. His hands froze in mid-gesture. His smile vanished. His entire body went rigid in the orange guest chair. Jimmy noticed immediately. His interviewer instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. Patrick? You okay? Patrick didn't respond. He was staring past the cameras, past the audience, toward the back of the studio. His knuckles were white where they gripped the armrest. The audience sensed the shift. The laughter died. 300 people suddenly uncertain, looking between Jimmy's confused face and Patrick's frozen expression. Another cough. Same pattern. Same labored quality. Patrick's jaw clenched. His eyes glistened. I know that cough. He whispered, barely audible over the studio microphones, but caught perfectly by the boom overhead. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted. And slightly panicked. Mr. Fallon, there's a man at the studio entrance. Security stopped him, but he says he knows Mr. Dempsey. He's not well. He's coughing a lot. Patrick was already moving. He stood from the guest chair, not the graceful standing of a scripted moment, but the abrupt, desperate movement of someone who's just heard a ghost. Let him in. Patrick said, his voice barely controlled. Please. Let him in right now. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 2008. Patrick Dempsey wasn't just an actor. By 2008, he was Dr. Derek Shepherd McDreamy, from Grey's Anatomy, one of the most beloved characters on television. His face was on magazine covers. His personal life was tabloid fodder. He had everything success could offer. But success hadn't made him forget where he came from. In 2008, between filming schedules, Patrick started volunteering at a cancer treatment center in Los Angeles. Not for publicity. Not for press. He just showed up quietly and spent time with patients. He'd sit with them during chemo sessions. He'd listen to their stories. He'd make them laugh when they needed laughter and sit in silence when they needed that instead. One afternoon in July, a nurse asked if he'd mind spending time with a patient who was having an especially difficult treatment day. A man named Robert Chin, mid-50s, stage 4 lung cancer, fighting his third round of chemotherapy with diminishing odds of success. Patrick walked into Robert's treatment room expecting the usual scenario. Small talk, maybe some questions about Grey's Anatomy, a brief distraction from the reality of poison dripping into veins. Instead, Robert looked up from his chair and said, "You're that actor. The one who plays the doctor." "Yeah," Patrick said, settling into the chair beside him. "But I'm not here as an actor today. I'm just here." Robert studied him for a long moment, then coughed. That distinctive wet, labored cough that comes from lungs STR, the buildings he designed that would outlast him. "Promise me something," Robert said one afternoon in December, his voice weak from another brutal treatment session. "When I'm gone, find Emma. Tell her I spent my last months talking to someone who listened. Tell her I wasn't alone. You're not going anywhere." Patrick said, but they both knew it was a kind lie. Robert coughed, that same labored pattern Patrick would never forget. "I'm going somewhere. We all are. But promise me you'll find her. Tell her about our conversations. She'll need to know her father's last friend was someone good." Patrick promised. Robert Chin died on January 4, 2009. Patrick attended the funeral. Not as a celebrity making an appearance, but as a friend who'd lost someone irreplaceable. He met Emma Chin, a brilliant 22-year-old woman with her father's eyes and sharp mind. He told her about their friendship, about the conversations, about how Robert had been teaching him about living right up until the end. "Thank you," Emma had said, crying in the church reception hall. "Thank you for seeing him as a person, not a patient." Patrick had given her his number. "If you ever need anything," he'd said. Anything at all. They'd stayed in loose touch over the years. An occasional email. A Christmas card. Emma had graduated, gotten a job at an architecture firm in New York, was building the career her father had wanted for her. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 15 years later, in Studio 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, that cough had returned. The production assistant held the door open. A man walked into the studio, thin, pale, mid-30s, wearing a hospital wristband under his jacket sleeve. He was coughing the same wet, labored pattern. Behind him, supporting his elbow, was Emma Chin. Patrick walked across the studio floor toward them. Jimmy Fallon stood beside his desk, watching. The Roots had lowered their instruments. The audience sat in abs. People who cared. The studio was completely silent. Hundreds of people, crew, audience, band, holding their collective breath. Patrick's face was wet with tears. He looked at David, at Emma, at young Lily holding her father's hand. Then he looked at Jimmy Fallon, who was crying openly at his desk. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy walked across the studio floor to where Patrick stood with the Chin family. The cameras followed him. The control room had stopped giving directions. Everyone understood this was bigger than television. "David," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not interrupting anything. You're exactly where you need to be." He looked at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to change what we're doing tonight." He turned to his production crew. "Can someone bring chairs? Real chairs. Comfortable ones." Within minutes, crew members had arranged a circle of chairs on the Tonight Show stage. Not the interview setup. Not the performance area. Just a circle. Jimmy sat down. Patrick sat beside him. David and Emma sat across from them. Lily sat in her father's lap. Jimmy addressed the cameras directly. "If you're watching at home, something real is happening right now. We're going to do something different tonight. We're going to listen." And they did. For the next 20 minutes, David Chin told his story. His diagnosis. His treatment. His fear for his daughter. Emma talked about losing her father and now facing the possibility of losing her uncle. Patrick talked about Robert, about the conversations they'd had, about how those 6 months had changed his understanding of what mattered. Lily, the 9-year-old girl, sat quietly through most of it. Then, near the end, she looked at Patrick and asked, "Did you really like my Uncle Robert?" Patrick knelt in front of her chair. "I loved your Uncle Robert. He was one of the wisest people I've ever known. Will you love my daddy too?" The studio showing up. For he gestured at the studio, the cameras, the audience. "For trusting me with this." Jimmy stood up and walked to his desk. He opened the drawer and pulled out a Tonight Show notebook, the one he used to write jokes and ideas every day. He brought it back to the circle. "David," Jimmy said, kneeling beside Lily. "I want Lily to have this. When you're gone, she can read it and know that on this night, her father was the bravest person in this room. That he showed up. That he mattered." The audience rose as one. Standing ovation. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the reverent recognition of courage witnessed. David held his daughter close, clutching the notebook and the photograph. Emma wrapped her arms around both of them. Patrick stood beside them, hand on David's shoulder. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. David Chin died 4 months later. Patrick Dempsey spoke at his funeral. Lily Chin, now 10 years old, stood at the podium and read from Jimmy Fallon's notebook. Jokes her father had laughed at during his final months. The photograph of Robert Chin and the Tonight Show notebook were buried with David. But Patrick made copies of the photograph. One for Emma, one for Lily, one for himself. That night changed The Tonight Show forever. Jimmy Fallon kept those chairs on set, just off camera, as a reminder that sometimes the best television happens when you stop performing and start being human.